So good evening. Good evening. Good evening. Hello there. Welcome. It's a pleasure to welcome you here tonight. So just a show of hands, how many of you have not been to a live legacy program? Whoa. Okay. Another show of hands. How many of you have not been to Union League National? I'm not counting tonight. Wow, everybody has. Okay. Well, then my last question is how many of you have not been to a legacy live event at Union League National? And that's all of us, because this is the first time we have ever done this. And looking from the turnout, I'm thrilled that all of you were here. So I think you know what the Legacy Foundation does. We're the nonprofit charity of the Union League of Philadelphia. We're rooted in the values that created our republic and in the principles that are the Union League. We believe in the Constitution of the United States and free enterprise and individual liberty. The programs that we conduct include, well, first of all, we care for all of the art and archival items collection of the Union League. We run civics programs for high school and college students, and we do lectures and exhibits and programs such as what we're doing tonight. The subject of tonight's program is the Union League in the Civil War and the 3 Civil War generals that are honored here at Union League National: Grant, Meade, and Sherman. Our presenters are our own Jim Mundy and John Meko. So Jim Mundy has been a part of the Union League staff for, get this, 44 years. He has had so many positions, both in the Legacy Foundation, the Abraham Lincoln Foundation before that, and the Union League. Get this, he has been librarian, archivist, house manager. This one floored me, Jim. Membership director, curator of art, and historian. I think there's nobody that knows more about the Union League than Jim Mundy. And with him tonight is John Meko, who is the executive director of the Legacy Foundation. And I can't believe that you have actually been doing this for 15 years. John was and Kira Foley-Tusman were the brains behind getting the 3 foundations into one foundation, and that was an amazing feat. So John oversees the foundation's educational programs, art collections, as well as our Heritage Center exhibits and the scholarship program. So, ladies and gentlemen, John Meko and Jim Mundy.
Some technical housekeeping first. We are Zooming as well. So Joe, I'm going to let you just do this. Thank you, Joan, and welcome. It's really fantastic that everyone is here with us today. Before I get into the presentation itself, just a couple of comments about the values and the Union League and all these wonderful new locations, amenity properties. Where's Bob Cavalier? What are we calling these now? Companion amenities. There we go. And one of the things that we're really trying to do is to bring these values to these properties. That's right. That's right. So Bob Cavalier, if you don't know, Bob is the Vice President for Activities and also is our liaison with the Legacy Foundation. And I hope you've all noticed we have new messaging here. So when you come onto this property, it says Union League. It says Love of Country Leads. You see the shield. There's other messaging. You're going to see a lot more flagpoles and American flags and all that stuff on this property, as well as all the properties, whether it's Toursdale or Liberty Hill, or the guardhouse, or the bungalow. So no matter where you are, you know you're at the Union League. And you might also know something about our values. And it's hard to do with just a visual, but you'll know something about patriotism, which of course is what this institution was founded on. So again, I thank Bob and the staff at all the properties, Jacob here at Liberty, UL National, and Kira Foley-Tusman, who's really spearheading that effort. So congratulations. And Jacob, yes, this place is spectacular, just like all of our other companion amenities. I got that right? Good. So before one other item, we're going to be doing more of this. So we'll have programs, not just here, but we have programs scheduled at Toursdale and at Liberty Hill. I'll tell you what those are at the end of this program, but please, if you're up in Lafayette Hill, if you're in Toursdale, please come to those programs as well. And then we'll be right back at the Union League doing what we do so well at 140 South Broad. So tonight's presentation's in two parts. The first part, I'm going to give you Union League 101, why we were founded and what we did during the Civil War. And then Jim's going to talk about the three generals that we've honored here at UL National, Grant, Meade, and Sherman. The one question you should have is why, if the person to my right knows more about the Union League than any other person in the history of the world, which is true, without question, why would John Meko be giving this presentation on the Union League and its founding? And I'll tell you, because we don't have that kind of time. Kira told me I had 13 minutes. And that's just not possible when you know as much as Jim. When you know as much as I do, I might be vamping by the time I get to the minute 10. But so that's the goal. I'll do a little kind of Union League 101, why we're founded, what we did during the Civil War, and then Jim's going to tell you about these three magnificent patriots that we've honored here at UL National. We will have time for questions, I hope. So to get us started, and I'll try to figure this out first of all. Okay, there we go. Okay, so the Union League of Philadelphia is founded in this city, Philadelphia, and there's a reason it's founded here and not some other city. And this quote, I think, says a lot: the most northern of southern cities. So Philadelphia is considered by many, both those in the north and those in the south, to be a southern city. Now, we don't have slaves in Pennsylvania in 1850s, certainly in the Civil War. There's no slaves in Pennsylvania. We are north of the Mason-Dixon line. Of course, we're on the Mason-Dixon line, Pennsylvania, where there are no slaves, but there are slaves a couple miles from here in Delaware. But in fact, this was a place, Philadelphia and Pennsylvania, that was very divided. Southern cities, the southern states, when they begin to secede, there are calls in Alabama and Mississippi for Pennsylvania to join them. This was not a joke. They thought this was possible. There were powerful politicians in Harrisburg that were calling for Pennsylvania to support the states that were seceding. They weren't joking. This was serious. This was a divided place. Well, why? Why were we so divided? Well, we start, of course, with money and textiles. So this is a textile mill in Manayunk. This image is from just prior to the Civil War. This mill did go out of business during the Civil War. And of course, this is the Joseph Ripka mill. And all of the textiles, or most of it, comes from cotton, of course. This is the largest textile producing city in the United States, one of the largest in the world. And it relies on cotton. And any disruption in that supply would be devastating to a lot of businesses in Philadelphia. By the way, the South would continually overplay this cotton hand. They really believed that the world couldn't exist without their cotton. Great Britain couldn't exist without their cotton. But there was some truth in it. It would have dire consequences for many in Philadelphia in the textile trade. But also there's banking interests in Philadelphia that Most of the banking that happens in the South is tied to Philadelphia. A lot of the business connections come through Philadelphia because it's South, because it's more South than New York and Boston and other cities. It's a transportation hub, a shipping hub. There are other reasons. Immigration. Large numbers of Irish and Germans are coming into Philadelphia and other eastern cities, and many of them are not happy about the possibility of slaves being emancipated and competing for their jobs. Other immigrants, interestingly, are lobbying very hard for abolition at the same time. So it's definitely a division. But there's a whole other group of people that are not happy about Lincoln and about this war or this coming war. And one of them is Pierce Butler. Some of you know this story, so just bear with me. Some of you don't. Pierce Butler is the grandson of Pierce Butler, who was an American Revolutionary War hero from South Carolina. He's one of the leading players in the Constitutional Convention. He signs the Constitution here in Philadelphia, or there in Philadelphia, I have to say now. And he is one of the main defendants, if you will. He defends slavery in this convention. It's in large part because of him that we have the 3/5 Compromise and the Fugitive Slave Clause. So he likes Philadelphia when he gets a taste of it in the 1780s, and he has a home there, does business there, raises his family there, and now 2 generations later, his son now is a Philadelphian. But he still owns slaves. In fact, he owns a lot of slaves. Pierce Butler sells 436 slaves in March 2nd or 3rd of 1859, the largest slave auction in the history of the United States. This is from a first family in Philadelphia. Where do they go to church, Jim? Where are they buried? Christ Church, right? This is a first family of Philadelphia. Pierce Butler, Philadelphian, large slave owner, largest slave auction in the history of the United States, not a fan of Abraham Lincoln and of the possibility of emancipation. So this is why we are a divided city. So Lincoln is, of course, elected in November of 1860. Immediately, the southern states start to secede, and April 12th, Fort Sumter is bombed. And initially, the reaction in Philadelphia, at least on the surface, seems quite positive. It's patriotic. There's all kinds of parades, and people are enlisting, and militias are running down to Washington from Philadelphia and from Pennsylvania to defend the capital. But things don't go very well in the beginning of the war. In fact, for almost the first 2 years of the war, they go very poorly. And this very short, quick war that was expected turns into a very bloody war. The Union loses just about every major battle in the East. There's a couple shining moments in the West with our hero Grant, but other than that, things are very bad. And in Philadelphia, the Southern sympathizers, the Copperheads, the Peace Democrats, if you will, are showing their ugly face. They are becoming emboldened, and these treasonous, these traitors are being noticed by patriots. Patriots like John Hare and George Boker. And you might recognize these 2 portraits. These are in the Founders Room, aptly enough, the Founders Room, George. Now you can tell your fellow Union League members that's why it's called the Founders Room, John Hare and George Boker. They are the ones that decide that they're going to form a club. And this club becomes the Union Club. And it's the predecessor of the Union League of Philadelphia. On November 15th, they have their first meeting. And Article 2 states, unqualified loyalty to the government of the United States and unwavering support for its measures for the suppression of the rebellion. But it doesn't say what they're going to do. It just says you have to, be of that mind. And it's a social organization. They meet on Saturday evenings, beginning on the 15th. And within a few weeks, they realize they have to do something else. And on December 27, this new club calls for a new club to be born, and that's the Union League. And the primary object is, quote, shall be to discountenance and rebuke by moral and social influences all disloyalty to the federal government, and to that end the association will use ever proper means in public and private. So they're going to do something, and that's the main difference. They become a much larger organization. The Union Club, by the way, exists until what year? As a kind of club within the club? 1906, the Union Club exists as a kind of club within the Union League of sorts. And they wanted to be a force in national affairs and to change what Philadelphia, first and foremost, believes and thinks about the Civil War. So one of the first things they do is they found other Union Leagues. This is the first. The Union League of Philadelphia is the first Union League. By the end of the war, there are over 700 Union Leagues. It becomes a movement, a patriotic movement. This, of course, is the most important of them. And probably the most important thing that we do, arguably, I think, is our publications. This becomes the communicator of Lincoln, of Union, and of abolition for the North, and actually starts to communicate that all over the United States. Things like the suspension of habeas corpus, bravery of African-American troops, the negative impact of slavery on the United States as a whole, on the rights of the freedmen. This one's actually interesting. This is a planter's almanac. And in this almanac, embedded within it, are articles about soil and planting. And inside there are instructions on how Confederate troops can desert. Now, this was actually, the idea was to get these into the troops' hands behind the lines. Do we have any evidence that this worked, Jim? Yes. You did? Okay. There was a tear-out pass of the market, and then you had to present that pass to the Union paper. So they saved the number of passes. So those of you on YouTube, the answer was yes. Thank you, Jim. Over a million publications were distributed. And of course, in terms of propaganda, this is about as good a piece as you get, right? This is a piece of propaganda, really. It's a wonderful piece of art as well. And it depicts Abraham Lincoln just after he signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And it hangs in Independence Hall as a symbol and a sign to Philadelphians to support Lincoln. We do things like raise troops. Now we raise troops. This is actually this is located just down the street from the Union League itself. It's the United States Colored Troop Recruitment Office. And the Union League is one of the first organizations that raises USCTs, United States Colored Troops. That's federal troops, and opens the first camp for federal soldiers, Camp William Penn. And you can make a direct line between that and the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment. So that's a major moment in American history. And of course, they were all African-American troops. The Union League also raises approximately 10,000 white troops, or the Union League regiments as well. The sanitary fair. This was an effort that raised over $1 million for the Sanitary Commission, and it's largely a Union League effort. In June of 1864, over $1 million raised for the support and care of injured and sick soldiers and sailors. So the thing that is probably most interesting, or one of the things that's interesting, is that the Union League was going to exist after the Civil War, and they knew this very early in their history. There are only 3 Union Leagues that are still in existence that were founded in the Civil War and have existed ever since. And we are the first and the best and the biggest and all of that. But in May of '65, we opened the League House right after the war ended. So we were going to be around for a while, and we'll have more Civil War roundtables or library hours on that subject in the months and years to come. But I wanted to end with this quote by Lincoln's first Secretary of War, Simon Cameron. The Union League under God did more than any other organization to suppress the rebellion. And if there's an organization that did more, no one has convinced me of that. And so I'm going to end on that and hand it over to Jim Mundy. Jim.
All right. Now, did anybody time John on that to make sure he stuck to his minutes? Yeah. All right. All right. I only get, geez, 8 minutes on, so anyway, we'll see what happens. All right. All right. Okay. So I've got to do this. You all recognize that, gentleman? Right. Surprisingly, the League has 3 Grant portraits and only 2 Lincoln portraits, which ought to tell you something about the relationship between Grant and the League itself. So Grant himself was born in Point Pleasant, Ohio. His father was a tanner, but the family stock itself is old New England Yankee, going back into the early 17th century. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, all right. His local representative, Thomas Hammer, submitted his name for admission to West Point, and he he matriculated there in the fall of 1839, and he would eventually graduate in June of 1843. He was ranked 21st out of 39, so he's clearly not a rocket scientist, okay, by his own admission. However, though, he would become, without any doubt, probably the war's best general, period. Now, as you can see, these are images of Grant when he was a young man as a soldier. And we think of him as that war-hardened, crusty old general, but I think it's kind of neat to see what he looked like when he was still a young man. So that's he's there now. When he entered West Point, he was only 5 feet 2 inches tall. So he was a tough little guy, but he grew 5 inches while he was there, and I doubt it was the Army food. But when he graduated, he was 5 feet 7 inches. So, and that was that. Now, Grant himself did not intend to make the Army a career, but it turned out that he did, and we were all the better off for it. So, for each of these generals, I'm only going to pick one military campaign that made them the most successful, if you will. Otherwise, we'd be here for days talking about their military career. So, quote from Grant. And I think this will sum it all up. The art of war is simple enough. Find out where your enemy is. Get at him as soon as you can. Strike him as hard as you can and keep moving. And that was the basis of his success, because no other Union general, or very few other Union generals, figured that out. So on March the 2nd of 1864, Lincoln promotes Grant to commander-in-chief of all Union armies, brings him to Washington, D.C. Grant does something very different. Rather than sitting in an office in Washington, he goes out into the field, and he will take his command headquarters with the Army of the Potomac that was then commanded by George Gordon Meade. Okay, so immediately Grant develops something called the Overland Campaign. Oh, but that turned out smaller than I thought. All right, you're looking at basically central Virginia, and especially the area with Richmond and then Petersburg. Richmond's in the center, Petersburg is in the south, all right? Because Grant was going to make sure that he went after Lee every chance he got, and he eventually stretched Lee out over 35 miles. No other Union general had been able to do that kind of thing. So within the Overland Campaign of May and June of 1864, we had the Battle of the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, and most infamously of all, Cold Harbor, which even by Grant's terms was a slaughter, and one he regretted later on in his career. In June of 1864, we have the Siege of Petersburg. Now, Petersburg is south of Richmond. It was the railroad hub that was feeding what was left of the Confederacy at that point in time, specifically Richmond itself. So Grant's thinking was, if he can get Petersburg, he's got Richmond. But it didn't quite work out that way, because Lee beat him to Richmond and then went into an entrenched position that would last until April the 2nd of 1865. All right. So, but Grant continued to hammer away at Richmond, and to the point where he did capture Petersburg on April the 2nd. April the 3rd, he captures Richmond. Lincoln enters Richmond, and basically the war is over. So that Overland Campaign mixed in with the Siege of Petersburg, and then of course taking the Confederate capital, was basically Grant's greatest military achievement during the war. And there were many other ones. Think of Vicksburg, for instance, and things like that. But that is Grant at Cold Harbor, right? Just a tough, war-hardened individual. Okay, this was his Army headquarters at Cedar Point, which was on the James River. That was basically where he and the Grant family lived for the whole duration of that campaign itself. And then after the war, members of the Union League dismantled it and brought it to Philadelphia, and it was on display in Fairmount Park, just north of Lemon Hill, until the late 1960s. And by that point, and you can see what it looked like on the left-hand side. And then at that point, though, it was deteriorating. So the National Park Service came along and took possession of it, conserved it, and then put it back at Cedar Point. Now in Virginia, so you can still see it today if you wish. So at the beginning of a nice Union League connection there with Grant. Okay. After the war, this is the Grant House. It was at 2039 Chestnut Street. So members of the League bought this house for the Grants. The Grants wanted to live in Philadelphia. They hated Washington, D.C., but it was very clear to them that Grant, with his military responsibilities after the war, could not commute from Philadelphia. It just wasn't going to work. So they sold their house and moved back to Washington, D.C. But again, another wonderful Union League connection that, not related to the war itself. And then Grant was a frequent visitor to the Union League during the war and after. So this is his visitor's card or guest card, and it's valid from October 1st to November 1st of 1868. And why is that interesting? Because what's going on in November of 1868? The first Republican presidential convention actually had already happened, and then he was being nominated, and now he's running for president in November of 1860. So obviously Grant felt it was important enough to be in Philadelphia often enough that the League issued him its own visitor's card. So, and this was one of the first things I ever bought when I was the archivist in 1988. Seriously, bought it from an usher at the old Academy of Music for $500. So, but it's so rare. It was worth every penny of it at the time. And then most interestingly enough is the gentleman on the left-hand side, you have no idea who he is, right? His name is John Russell Young. He was one of the earliest members to join the League in 1863. He signed the League's Articles of Association on December the 27th. He was a journalist by profession, born in County Tyrone in Ireland, so he's an Irish immigrant, young lad. And after the war, he went to New York, where he worked for the New York Herald. And after Grant left office in 1877, they decided to go on a 2.5-year trip around the world. And John Russell Young, as a journalist for the New York Herald, was invited to go along, and he accompanied the Grants on their entire voyage, literally circumnavigating the globe. And no American president had done anything quite like that before. So on the right-hand side, you can see the spine columns for the 2-volume set. That's how much material there was. It's called Around the World with General Grant. And it is just, and so here is a Union League member, a founding member of the Union League, who is now spending 2.5 years with the Grants. And he would become a close associate, just a great friends with the Grants itself. And interestingly enough, when the group was in China, John Russell Young met soon-to-be Viceroy Li Hung-chang. And in Grant convinced Chester Arthur to appoint John Russell Young as minister to China or ambassador to China in 1882. And then in 1896, Li Hung-chang would visit Philadelphia as part of a Chinese delegation to the United States, and the League would throw him a big reception. So it's interesting how these things all connect through history. So General Grant, undoubtedly the best general in the war, I think, bar none, but with some really wonderful Union League connections. And I hope that that's something that maybe nobody knew about so far tonight. So hopefully, we'll see. Okay, so we're moving on now. How did I do? Anybody timing me on that? Did I get my 8 minutes in? No, you sure? Okay. Oh, I've got free reign then. What the heck, All right. If nobody's paying attention, I'll take advantage of it then. All right, fine. Okay. Now, I hope you recognize another portrait that's in the Union League connection, and this is William Tecumseh Sherman by James Reed Lambton, who was a member of the League when he painted this portrait. Sherman was born in Lancaster, Ohio, and again, an old Yankee name, right? Remember Roger Sherman in Connecticut? Same family. His father, who was a lawyer, died when he was only 9 years old. And one of his next door neighbors in Lancaster, named Thomas Ewing Sr., took young Will in, or Billy, as he was called back then. And Sherman would become part of the Ewing family, which is very important because he would eventually marry one of Ewing's daughters, Eleanor. So, and that will play into the story later on as we get along in this. And it was Ewing who later became a senator from Ohio who was able to accomplish the appointment of Sherman to West Point. And this is what Sherman said about his years at West Point. In studies, I always held a respectable reputation with the professors and generally ranked among the best, especially in drawing, chemistry, mathematics, and natural philosophy. My average demerits per annum were about 150, which is right under the number where you're going to get expelled, which reduced my final class standing from number 4 to 6. He only dropped 2 ranks. One smart cookie. Undoubtedly he was a brilliant man. Okay. But like everybody in the military, he had his issues and he had his problems. He had some successes and he had some failures. But Grant's promotion in March of 1864 to commander-in-chief opened the door for Sherman to become appointed the commander of the Western Union armies, which is where Grant had made his reputation in 1862 at Forts Donelson and Henry and then Shiloh and things like that. So that's the door that opened for Sherman, because once he got through that door, he would become one of the great strategists in the Union Army, and just, if not one of the most, equally like Grant, determined generals that there was. So we all think of Sherman. Now, this is Sherman as a young man. That is him on the left-hand side. It's kind of neat to know what he looked like as a young man. And then, of course, that is he on the right-hand side. Not really good at keeping his hair straight, but that wasn't necessary at that point in time. But you get an idea of what he was like and his personality. Now, this was going to be his greatest military achievement. And we pretty much know about the capture of Atlanta and the Great March to the Sea. So the Atlanta campaign, now again, at this point, Eastern Tennessee was controlled by the Union, and they were mostly pro-Union citizens there, believe it or not. So Chattanooga, which is just north of the Georgia border, becomes the launching point for Sherman's Atlanta campaign, which lasted from May the 1st to September the 2nd of 1864. And we all know the story about Atlanta burning and things like that. So I don't want to go into great details about that, but let's just say it was the first time that a Union general had really taken it to the South. And the timing was especially good because what else is going on in the fall of 1864, as we just mentioned before, was an American presidential campaign, right? That's when they happened. Lincoln was running for a second term, and this victory pretty much clinched Lincoln's victory because the Union Army had not been doing well up until now. So this was an incredibly important military win and then political win for both Sherman and Lincoln. Sherman would next move on to Savannah. So he's going from the upper left-hand corner down to the lower right-hand corner, right? Okay, that's him. You can see Savannah there on the coastline. He captured that on December the 22nd of 1864 and wired Lincoln very famously that, Mr. Lincoln, it is my great pleasure to present to you a Christmas present, the city of Savannah. And that also, again, convinced the North that the end is near. And it convinced the South that the end was near as well. So the last bit of his campaign was going from Savannah in the lower right-hand corner up to the upper right-hand corner, where he would eventually take Raleigh, North Carolina, and where on April the 26th, right? Now the war ends in theory on April the 9th of 1865, but on April 26th, Confederate General Joseph Johnston surrenders to Sheridan, and the jig is really up at this point in time. So Sherman has done what no other Union general did, and that was just decimate the South, okay? But Sherman has great quotes. So I picked three that I hope you enjoy. And this might lead to some questions later on in the Q&A. So the first one is, Grant stood by me when I was crazy, and I stood by him when he was drunk. And now we stand by each other. Okay, because those two were inseparable. As a military pair, they were inseparable and they were unbeatable. Okay, now the next one is a little more, I think, Shermanish. War is cruelty. There is no use trying to reform it. The crueler it is, the sooner it will be over. And of course, there's always that famous three-word line, war is hell. And then last quote, if I had my choice, I would kill every reporter in the world, but I am sure we would be getting reports from hell before breakfast. So every Union general had his problems with reporters, and Sherman was no exception. So this is Sherman outside of Atlanta, all right? And you can see, just a ramrod straight figure. Again, not a whole lot taller. This is Columbia, South Carolina, going up in smoke. Sherman himself estimated that the damage caused by the Union troops in the South was over $100 million in 1864 dollars. Okay, so yeah, right, do the math. Amazing, right? Okay, now the Union League connection. Recognize any of those folks? All right, on the left is Eleanor Ewing Sherman, one of William Tecumseh Sherman's 8 children that he had with his wife, Eleanor. And on the right is her husband. His name is Alexander Montgomery Thackara. And if you actually know the Thackara name, you just don't know you know it. Because if you go into Lincoln Hall and you look at that beautiful chandelier, right, it was made by his father's gas light fixture company. Okay, his father was Benjamin Thackara. It was one of the largest, actually Philadelphia, the 2 largest gasolier manufacturers in the country. Cornelius and Baker was the first, but Thackara and Sons was the second. And so young Alexander actually made a career in the Navy right out of, he went through Annapolis, retired after 23 years, then went to work for his father. In the meantime, he had met Eleanor Sherman, and they got married in the early 1870s. And there you go. So, and to this day, if you go to Villanova University, because now, just a little side, Sherman himself was a Scotch Presbyterian. The Ewings were Irish Catholic. And even though Sherman never converted, all of his children were raised as Catholic. So she was married in a Catholic ceremony. And Sherman never quite got over it to begin with. But nonetheless, though, it was just, I did left out those Sherman quotes. So anyway, an interesting mixture of couples, and they were eventually, young Alexander was appointed as ambassador to France in 1896, and they moved to France, and that is where they both died. Eleanor tragically in 1915. So another neat connection between William T. Sherman and the Union League of Philadelphia. Okay. Out of curiosity, anybody know that one? Or is that all new? Brand new? Hot dogs. All right. That's what we're after. Okay. All right. I mean, I figured everybody can Google Grant, Sherman, and Meade, and Wikipedia will tell you everything you need to know, but this is the kind of minutia that I think makes history fun and league history even more interesting. All right. So here's our last gentleman, George Gordon Meade. Now, Meade was born in Cadiz, Spain in 1815, even though he was the third generation of an Irish Catholic family in Philadelphia itself. His father was a merchant in Spain, working with both the Spanish and the American merchants, became fairly wealthy, but he was bankrupted by his support of the Peninsular War and in the early 1820s, and that made him persona non grata in Spain. Nobody was paying him the money that he was owed, and he would eventually become bankrupt, return to Philadelphia, and when he would die in 1828, leaving his family in poverty, basically. So young George attended the American Classical and Military Lyceum in Philadelphia. I don't have, you can see. Now, there is no image of young George. I don't think he was actually young, to be honest. I think this is the way, that's what he looked like when he was 10 years old. I'm convinced of it. Okay, so there's just no young image of George Gordon Meade, unfortunately. But Meade, after attending classes at the American Classical and Military Lyceum in Philadelphia, went to the Mount Hope Institution in Baltimore, and then entered West Point in 1831. So he is clearly the oldest of the three. He graduated 19th in his class of 56 cadets in 1835, so a little on the brainier side. And he was commissioned a second brevet lieutenant. And he, again, wasn't really interested in making a career in the Army, but when he couldn't make a living as an engineer, because when you graduate West Point, you graduate as a lieutenant with an engineering degree. Okay, all right, just so you know. And he would become one of the best engineers in America in the 1840s and the 1850s, especially when it came to coastal lighthouses and things like that. But nonetheless, that was that. So this is Meade's greatest military achievement, and that was Battle of Gettysburg, July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of 1863. Meade only got the appointment as commander of the Army of the Potomac on June the 28th. And when the courier arrived early in the morning and woke up Meade, Meade actually thought he was being arrested because the politics were so tough in the Army of the Potomac that was the life. Yeah, who would have thought? Instead, he was given command of the Army of the Potomac, and he would do well with it. So, anybody been to Gettysburg by any chance? Oh, great. Oh, I don't need to tell you about it then. Great. I just say 5 minutes, and that's great because I could use it probably. No, I'm just kidding though. But anyway, if you have not been to Gettysburg, I cannot urge you enough to go there. It is one of the most sacred places on American soil. It just speaks to anybody if you're out there. And if you grab a certified battlefield tour guide, spend 3, 4, 5, 6 hours with them, and it's like an experience you've never had before. So unfortunately, even though now Meade doesn't always get a lot of the credit I think he deserves for having won that battle, because there was so much infighting in the Army of the Potomac itself. And he especially had two enemies. One was General Daniel Sickles, who commanded the Third Army Corps, and who basically almost lost the Battle of Gettysburg on July the 2nd by moving his corps forward of the Union line, and he was saved by Winfield Scott Hancock. And then there was George Butterfield, who was the inherited chief of staff of his command operation. And Butterfield, who was a great Sickles fan, just tried to throw monkey wrenches in everything that Meade did. So Meade had to overcome a lot of adversity, not just on the battlefield, but within the Army itself. But nonetheless, he did overcome it. And I think he deserves to be known as the victor of Gettysburg, and the only Union general to beat Robert E. Lee on a field of battle, by the way. All right. So what's the Union Lee connection? But that, by the way, is Meade's headquarters at the battlefield. That's the Taneytown Road to the right. And this, now, I mentioned that Grant went with Meade and the Army of the Potomac. Grant was constantly looking over Meade's shoulder. He didn't really quite trust him, even though he said he did. He really didn't. I mean, Grant's buddies were going to be William T. Sherman and Philip Sheridan, great cavalry commander in the Shenandoah Valley in 1864. This is Massaponax Church in Virginia. On the bench on the left is George Gordon Meade sitting down, looking at a map, and looking right over his shoulder is U.S. Grant. And you can see that even better illustrated on the right-hand image. So Grant was always micromanaging everything that Meade did, unfortunately, but that's the way it went. So, but Meade stuck in there, although Meade did offer to resign, but Grant convinced him to stay on. He needed his military skills. So, all right. Now, the sculpture on the left and the painting on the right. You recognize the painting, I hope? Okay. Who can tell me where it is in the League House? Pop quiz. Second floor. All right, close. It's between the second and the third floors on the landing and the 15th Street stairwell. All right. Done by League member Daniel Ridgway Knight. Okay. All right. On the left-hand side, you can see an equestrian of Meade that was done by Daniel Chester French. It was his first major equestrian commission. He was still a student at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. And the Fairmount Park Association, Art Association, of which Meade was a member from 1865 until he died in 1872, thought that it was appropriate that they commemorate Meade's military career by having the sculpture erected. Now, it was originally designed, or actually was designed, to be placed on the apron on the north side of City Hall, where there are two other Union equestrian sculptures there right now. But the Meade family thought it was more appropriate that that the sculpture be placed in Fairmount Park, where he was a park commissioner, and it is pointed in the direction of his grave at Laurel Hill Cemetery across the Schuylkill River. So if you ever go there when the trees aren't around, and if you're in Laurel Hill, you can look and see it, and then vice versa. So that's what happened there. So that was that. Now, the sculpture was unveiled on October the 18th of 1887. 20 to 30,000 people in attendance, many former Union officers and things like that. But that night, the Meade Memorial Reception was given at the League House. So the League was involved with, members were involved with the commissioning of it and its unveiling at the same time. And then here we have the most unique gold medal ever awarded by the League. And it is considered a gold medal, but it's not the gold medal. But this one was what we call bespoke. And it was presented to George Gordon Meade on July the 4th of 1866. And this is what it says. Presented July 4th, 1866 to Major General George Gordon Meade by the Union League of Philadelphia as a token of their gratitude and of his countrymen. So at least Philadelphia appreciated what Meade had done militarily during the war, even if the rest of the country didn't, and things like that. So so the left-hand side is called the obverse, and the right-hand side is called the reverse. And around the obverse, it has Victor of Gettysburg, the deliverer of our state, and the faithful soldier of our country, July 1863. So Philadelphia really did come to his support. The engraver was Anthony Beckett, who was the associate engraver at the U.S. Mint from 1857 to 1864. And Meade, by the way, is the only individual in the League's history to receive both a silver medal and a gold medal. So very unusual there. So the League, if nobody else did, the League came through for Meade after the Meade came through for his country. So there you go. All right. So I hope you learned something different about those three generals, especially as it relates to the League itself. Because I think that's the kind of, as I said, that's the fun stuff. It seems like minutia, but to me, it's the juice of history. So it makes it juicy. All right. Well, thank you for listening.
Thank you, Jim. We do have time for a few questions, if there are any questions. Yes, Karen.
Great presentation, thank you. Why is it that Grant didn't have confidence or did not like Meade?
Right. Basically, no, he did not like Meade. After the Battle of Gettysburg, Meade was sharply criticized from Lincoln on down the command chain for not following after the Confederate Army and Robert E. Lee. Meade was an old line soldier. He didn't have the aggressiveness that Grant did, or even Sherman did, or that Lincoln wanted him to have. And I think that just tarnished his reputation to the point where, even though Grant said he wanted Meade to continue command of the Army of the Potomac, he never really trusted him. Hence that scene at Massaponax, church, things like that. So.
Other questions? Yes.
Interestingly, we are in Cape May County here. So if you draw a parallel, we're right along the same line as Washington DC. So are we or are we not below the Mason-Dixon line?
We are below the Mason-Dixon line right here, I believe, right? Yeah, we're by quite a few miles, actually. So yes, very good point. Philadelphia, of course, is above it, but we are now below it. Yes. Other questions? I do. I have a couple of online questions, and I'll just try to. Why were the three nines here named after these? How did that happen? So that's a good question. And I believe Charlie Davidson was president. Was it Charlie? It was the president of the Union League who said to Jeff, "I want this to be some Union League connection." Well, there's no real great connection historically, so we have to. Yes, Bill.
3 nines before were the South.
No, I'm getting to that. Yeah,
Oh,
exactly.
oh,
Yeah, no, right. But in fact, Meade never played on the North Course here. Grant never played on the West, and Sherman never played in the South. It just never happened. That part is made up. But the question was, how, what can we do? And Jeff's had the idea, why don't we name the 3 nines after some Union League character or part of our history? And so Jim and I got to talking. We said, why don't we make them generals? And let's think of a general from the North, a general from the South, and a general from the West. And I think it was pretty obvious who should be who. Because although I don't think each of the things you mentioned, actually, although Grant was still in the East in your example, but Grant made his bones, if you will, in the West. And of course, Sherman, most of his great activity happened in the South, and Meade's command was entirely in the East. So we thought that made sense. And Bill, you can tell people that Sherman hit this 9-iron on the Sherman 9 to within 6 feet and all of that. But yes, so that's how that happened. Any other? Yes, John. I'll repeat it. Go ahead, John.
Gettysburg, talk about it being a great battlefield park. Is there another war in America or anywhere in the world that was photographed able to recreate battles like Gettysburg is being recreated to the 1860s?
So the question is there any other battlefield of that era, I assume, that was photographed like Gettysburg?
Vicksburg, because it was such a long campaign, comes close, to be honest. Now, Vicksburg, all right, so Gettysburg is won on July the 3rd of 1864, and John C. Pemberton, who was from Philadelphia but was a Confederate general at this point, surrenders the Confederate Army at Vicksburg on July the 4th. So those two battles are going on simultaneously, and they're both being photographed at the same time. The big difference is that when you see photographs of the Gettysburg battlefield, those are all posed. That is, the photographers went around and moved the bodies to make it look like they had been fighting. Well, there was no, photography is still pretty primitive. I mean, the first photograph from Philadelphia was 1839, and we're barely 20 years behind that. So all those photographs were actually staged by the photographers to make it look like the battle had been fought there. So keep that in mind. But Gettysburg was certainly, I think, between the two of them, those are the most photographed battles in the period.
So Jim, don't go far. The question is, Grant, you mentioned Grant was at the Union League. Did Meade and Sherman visit the Union League?
Yes. Meade surprisingly never joined the Union League. Everybody thinks he would have because he's from Philadelphia, but he never did. But he was a guest there many, many times, given his status and given the way the League just actually loved the man. Sherman was there, yes. Actually, if you go in the library, and turn to the left, you'll see a 4-legged table that's sitting there. And at that table, when President Hayes was, when Hayes was president, around that table was a number of Union generals, including Grant and Sherman themselves. So we know that Grant, so yes, they were in Philadelphia and they were at the League itself. I'm not sure how many times though, to be honest. So.
Any other questions?
Can I just add one thing? I had that senior moment a minute ago about the Catholic connection with the Ewings or the Shermans in Villanova University. So apparently Eleanor Sherman, when she was in Philadelphia, Eleanor Sherman Thackeray, met some Augustinians. And of course, Villanova University, I think, is 1848. And so before she left for France, she gave all of her Sherman family memorabilia to Villanova University, which included her father's uniforms, his swords, and correspondence. So if any of you remember the 1864 exhibit that we had in the league, oh my gosh, when 2014, we had borrowed Sherman's uniform from the Atlanta campaign and had it on display in the exhibit itself. Really neat stuff to see. And if you think Grant was small, Sherman wasn't much bigger. So
this is sort of a question. I don't think it needs an answer, but it's a good way to end. How did Jim Mundy learn so much about the Union League? And I guess that's what 44 years and a very inquisitive mind will get you. And so, Jim, thank you so much. We appreciate it. So my thanks to all of you for coming tonight. I want to remind you, and this is a crowd, I know so many of you because you're so generous to the Legacy Foundation, but I'll say it anyhow. This happens because of the voluntary support of our members. We're not funded directly through the Union League. We are funded through voluntary contributions from members who believe in the values and the spirit and want to share those values. And it's so important that we share those values today. And so I thank you all for making this possible. And I look forward to seeing you down here, although we don't have anything scheduled quite yet. We will. We have, though, 3 programs coming up. 2 of them are actually one at Liberty Hill and one at Toursdale. On the 12th of July, at Liberty Hill, we have the Battle of Barron Hill. So unlike this property, which doesn't have any direct kind of battle or anything happening on it, Liberty Hill does. There was a skirmish there called the Battle of Barron Hill. It involved Lafayette, and it's interesting. It's not quite as dramatic as Gettysburg, but it's worth a library hour at Liberty Hill on the 12th of July. And we have a Civil War Roundtable at the Union League, 140 South Broad Union League, with Wayne Motz, who's the new president and executive director of the Gettysburg Foundation. It's on Pickett's Charge. And on the 31st of August, a library hour at Toursdale with Stephen Fried. And I can't remember what's the topic? That's right, Benjamin Rush, Dr. Rush. So we look forward to seeing you at one of or more, or maybe all of those programs in the coming weeks. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.